Okay, today's a treat. Today we're going to talk about Gary Shteyngart's Little Failure. It was published by Random House in 2014. I picked this book up because I heard it was about a guy who grew up in Littleneck, Queens, about the time I did. This guy was born in 1972, so he's 5 years younger than I am. I also heard the book was funny. The book is funny. And I thought I would relate to the book because he's an outer boroughs guy like me. I did relate to the book, but for a lot more than that. Basically, it's the story about a guy who was born in Leningrad in the Soviet Union in the early 70s, spends the first 6 or 7 years of his life there, keeping hunger at bay, his family keeping hunger at bay, and then in 1979, according to Shteyngart, Jimmy Carter makes a deal with the Russians that he will give grain and high tech to the Russians in exchange for the Soviet Union allowing Russian Jews to emigrate to the US and to Israel. Anyway, Shteyngart comes over to the US without any knowledge of the language, okay? Totally clueless about culture, having believed all the Russian propaganda. Suddenly he enters into this abundance which is kind of out of his reach, and he's got to somehow assimilate. That's basically the core of the book. That's the core of the book. I would say that if you take away the first chapter of this book and you take away the last 10 chapters of this book, it's almost a seamless masterpiece. I'm not overstating it. I mean, the guy is capable of putting so much emotion on the page. The gamut of emotions that he can fill a scene with, I mean, I feel like I felt in the hands of a genius at times. There's this one scene where he comes over on the plane with his parents, and his parents have packed in these big army bags like hundreds of Russian compasses that have a hammer and sickle on them because they need to sell something to sort of survive in the West, okay? And one of the bags bursts in the airport. And so the way Shteyngart describes it is that his parents are on their hands and knees in the airport in Vienna, trying to pick up all these compasses, right? And there he is, like on a bench, like reading a map. Okay, and this Viennese lady suddenly appears randomly in a fur coat and gives him this Mozart chocolate. I mean, there is so much in that scene. There's like the humiliation of the immigrant. There's the kind of like cluelessness of him being a child and not realizing the magnitude of this experience for his parents. And then suddenly there's this kind of element of freedom, of kind of abundance that's also sort of put into the scene. I mean, it's a scene that speaks so much to his particular experience and to his age at the time, and to how kind of overwhelming this experience was to him, and how it was kind of impossible for him to sort of get it all into his head or to make emotional or even intellectual sense of it. But at the same time, he's making emotional and intellectual sense of it for us. I mean, it's impressive. There are some really interesting scenes about bullying in this book, because he goes to Queens and his parents put him in a Jewish school in Queens, and he's like the most hated member of the class, okay? He doesn't know how to speak the language. People laugh at him. People beat him up. He's small. He's tiny. He's getting bullied, and it converts him into a bully. I remember a few years ago, I think it was 2018, this book came out by a woman by the name of Tara Westover. The book was called Educated. It was a memoir, and it was about her sort of growing up off the grid out in the West with this fanatically religious family and homeschooled, and she's kind of bullied or abused by her older brother and by her father, and she comes across as victimized, and she comes across as sort of overcoming that victimization. But she never comes across as a human being. She never comes across as a well-rounded character, because it's as if she never broke a plate in her life. In this book by Gary Shteyngart, he's a completely well-rounded character. He's super sensitive, super intelligent. He becomes brutal. He becomes repulsive. He shows the monster in him, and you read it and you think, Jesus, the monster is also in me. Also, there are scenes where Shteyngart's parents hit him, like the father smacks him, and the mother says, well, don't hit him in his head because he needs to think with his head. But you never get a sense that the parents are villains, because they also come across as tender and kind of clueless. They're almost as the subjects of the culture they were raised in. And so the book gives you insight into how culture can form character, and how culture can form human beings, and perspectives on raising children. Victimization isn't really a word that even enters my head as I read this book. Also, it's so hard for writers to write about writing in a way that it speaks to the story and serves the story at a deep level. Shteyngart, he's in the 6th grade, and he starts to write a science fiction novel, and his teacher, Mrs. S, encourages him in it, and at one point calls on him to read to the class, and he starts reading this science fiction novel to the class, and suddenly the class goes completely silent, and they're rapt by his storytelling abilities. And at that moment, he realizes that what's going to lift him out of this hole, what's going to assimilate him, is his artistic talent. The book, I think, should have ended when Shteyngart goes to Stuyvesant High School in Manhattan. His mother would pick him up every day after high school to take the safe train back to Littleneck. But one day, a friend of his, this black kid, invites him to go play ultimate frisbee in Central Park. And so he kind of ducks his mother and takes the train out to Central Park with this kid. And this kid is leading him through the train, one car after another car, which you're not supposed to do. And this kid is doing it in this carefree way, and Shteyngart is following him, and they start exchanging obscenities, bonding over how they use obscenities, and then they get to Central Park, and he's playing ultimate frisbee, and for the first time in his life, he's able to play a sport and hold his own. He's able to catch the frisbee. There's this beautiful scene. Everyone's laying out on the green sheep meadow in Central Park. It's surrounded by buildings. This is New York, and he's playing the game, and he wants the moment to stop so that he can soak it all in. And finally he calls a timeout, and he's able to soak it all in, and he looks around. And later, after the game, he goes home on the subway, and he's walking through the subway cars just like he did with his friend, but now he's alone, and he's feeling like a New Yorker, and he's, for the first time in his life, he feels like he's not Russian. I mean, this is the climax where the book should have ended. That is assimilation. He has assimilated. The book did not need to go beyond that point, I don't think. Everything else is excess. Look, there are moments in the book after that where he writes almost at the same inspired level. He writes really, really well about love and about longing. Most of the stuff at Stuyvesant isn't very good because that's where he falls into drugs and alcohol. He doesn't write well about that. Also, later on when he goes to Oberlin College in Ohio, it's like he's trying to write a send-up but at the same time he wants to take it seriously. Also, the book is framed by this trip back to Leningrad with his parents. His parents return for the first time in like 20 or 30 years, and Shteyngart is with them. The final chapter is supposed to be a summary, thematic summary of a lot of things that are brought up in the book. I don't think it works. It seems to me that when you have a writer at the level of Shteyngart, you don't need to put this kind of frame on the book. It seems as though the frame is imposed so that the book can contain more material than it really should have. The book in many ways falls into the category of, for example, J.R. Moehringer's The Tender Bar, or Rick Bragg's All Over But the Shoutin. These books are all by writers who basically triumphed. When Moehringer stayed in Manhasset, and when he is hanging out with the crew at Steve's bar, and they're reading Breslin on the beach, the book basically reaches the highest level of literary art. But when he goes to Harvard, or when he's triumphing in his journalistic career, the book is only interesting at best. The same goes for Rick Bragg's book. When he's growing up in the Deep South, and he has this really sharp, sensitive, intelligent perspective on the world he grew up in, the book is out of this world. But once he makes it as a reporter, the book doesn't have the same power. It's the same with Shteyngart's book. The moment when Shteyngart realizes he's got an advance on his book and a book contract, and his life has changed, that has nowhere near the power as the scene where he is reading his science fiction story to a 6th grade class. His triumph in the literary world is incidental to his story. Maybe it's important to him, but it's not really important to us. It's as though that affirmation has nothing to do with the forming of their character. And they know it. And so when they're writing about when they were nobody, and when they were yearning to become someone, that's when the book takes off. So would I recommend this book for 230 pages? Absolutely. You got to read it. The rest, I can take or leave.